Hi, I'm Emily Pfeiffer, and this is my classification project. So here we just have a quick table of contents, and then our little introduction. So I decided to choose a data set having to do with Kickstarter, like crowdfunding data. I retrieved the data set from Kaggle. It has about 380,000 Kickstarter campaigns and the data associated with them, as well as whether or not they were successful in meeting their goal. It was created about 2 years ago, and among the 14 predictor columns, we have a quick description. We have the title of the campaign, the subcategory and main category. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. The amount pledged. Then we had a couple conversion rates. One was done by Kickstarter's own built-in conversion. Another was done by this Fixer API, which seemed to be a lot more accurate. So, but we'll come back to that. I first began with importing the necessary libraries, opening and reading the file, checking it out. Things look pretty good. Oops. And the first thing I decided to do with data cleaning was just take a look at my data types. Things mostly made sense, but I wanted to make sure that deadline and the launched column were both encoded as datetime columns so that I could use that to my advantage. Then I moved on to looking for null data, and I found, a little under 4,000 pieces of null data in my USD pledged column. But I decided that the USD pledged and the just pledged and goal column were kind of redundant, considering we already had a more accurate conversion with USD pledged real and USD goal real. So I removed these redundant columns, and then I just dropped the remaining null values, which was only about 4 in my name column. And then I moved on to looking at duplicates. Just since there was so much data, I wanted to make sure that there weren't a bunch of the same campaign in here. So the first thing I did was I looked for duplicates in the ID column, but I didn't find any. So I thought that was good news. It looked like everything was pretty individual. I did see that when I looked for duplicates in the title, there was a solid amount, about almost 3,000 campaigns that had similar names to each other or the same name as each other. A lot of them are pretty generic, as you can see, such as like new EP/music development. That one specifically had about 41 of the same project, or 41 projects that had this name. I decided to leave them in because even though the titles weren't very creative, I did think that it would probably be good data to look at. Then I decided to see if there was any misentered data. When I was exploring things, I found that in the country column there was this n comma 0 quotation mark country, which I could not find anything about online. So since it accounted for about less than 1% of my data, I decided to just drop it. Then I also just wanted to take a couple histograms of my numerical data. Obviously ID is just a square because each one has one. But backers, USD goal, and the pledge column all look like columns, so they're not very normal. Which made me decide to kind of just explore them a little bit more. It looks like they were pretty zero heavy, so I investigated further and found that the backers column actually had about 50,000 projects with 0 backers, which is about 15% of data. That is a lot of data, but I also figured that would be helpful and insightful, so I left it in. I didn't want to normalize my data before I did exploratory data analysis because I wanted to get an idea of what the real numbers were, but I did just kind of want to take a look at what would happen if I did standardize goals. So checked it out. Looks pretty normal, so I'll remember to normalize and standardize everything before actually doing my classification, running those models. And then I took some more descriptive statistics of backers. I just wanted to take a look at kind of like what the largest ones were. And I saw obviously these are kind of some outliers. The most successful project had about 200,000 backers. And I remember I actually looked up Kickstarter on Wikipedia before I started analyzing my data, just to get a better sense of, the crowdfunding idea and everything. And I remember actually reading about this campaign. I think it was actually famous. It's Exploding Kittens one. Also, who could forget a name like that? Um, and again, even though it was an outlier, I knew that it obviously wasn't like misentered data. So I also thought that it could be insightful. So I decided it would be best practice to just leave it in. And then I began on with some EDA. So first was pretty straightforward. I just had a distribution of the main categories. It wasn't very even. It looks like film and video was a lot more popular than dance. There was only about 15 main categories for people to choose from. But as you can see, they definitely had their favorites. For subcategories, I actually just wanted to look at the top 15 since there was about 150, or I guess it was 159 unique little subcategories. It looks like there's some overlap here, like fashion, art, food, some of these more generic subcategories that were also basically, real category or main categories as well. So those were obviously some of the more popular subcategories. And as you can see, it wasn't as balanced, or it wasn't very balanced here either. People clearly had their favorite subcategories. And then I wanted just to see kind of what proportion of campaigns were successful and which were not. So I found that about half of them were failed in reaching their monetary goal. A little over a third were successful. And then we kind of had some of these iffy things, like we had some that were suspended or live, I guess at the time that the data was getting gathered, but each of those are less than 1%. And then about 10% of the data was, or 10% of the campaigns ended up being canceled, which I kind of just ended up lopping in with the failed campaigns. Then I wanted just to see about this distribution of currency. It looks like USD dominates above all these other categories. Same with country. Most campaigns are launched in the US, so this makes sense looking at the currency graph as well. Great Britain comes in second. And then I wanted to extract a couple features. So one of the ones I did was duration of project, which I did by just subtracting deadline from launched. And then I also extracted launch year, launch month, launch day. And in there, I was just exploring around. I found we had some data that didn't make sense in here, so I decided to remove the 7 or 8 campaigns that were apparently started in 1971, because obviously that's not correct. I also made a column for the average pledge per backer, or pledge per backer, which I did take the log of that, even though I said I wasn't going to standardize things before EDA. And then, again, I just got some more statistics. So, average number of backers in a failed campaign, about 16. In the canceled ones, it was 26. So, the most successful ones, or average number of backers for successful Kickstarters, was 264. So, there's obviously a pretty big difference between the successful Kickstarters and the failed Kickstarters. Of course, was that outlier in there, so I'm sure that did influence this a great deal. However, the duration of these Kickstarters seemed to be pretty similar, though. For failed and canceled, it was both 35, and for successful Kickstarters, it looks like 32 was the average number of days that it was up. Then I took a look at average goal per category by year. So this is kind of interesting because I saw like a big jump for journalism between 2009 and 2010, this olivey green color over here. And then there were just a couple just disproportionate jumps, or like comics between 2013 and 2014. My best guess is that maybe like a very successful comic campaign went viral in 2013, which inspired a bunch of people in 2014. That seemed to happen a couple times. Otherwise, it looks like a lot of them stay relatively the same proportion, such as, like technology is usually had like one of the highest goals. Not every year, but pretty consistently it was up there. Um, but it was interesting looking at some of these trends. And then I actually made an interactive graph to break down launch day, launch month, and launch year. So you can hover over these and see the exact numbers. And then, I wanted to see what number of successful campaigns or failed campaigns kind of correlated with this. Obviously, since we had many more failed campaigns than successful campaigns, these numbers are a lot bigger on the side here. Otherwise, it seems like these tend to follow each other. Like most people, whether your campaign fails or is successful, I guess a lot of people do like to launch their campaign and start chasing their dreams on a Monday. A few things did stick out, such as July seemed to be the worst month for people to launch. Let's see. I also took a look at the top categories for successful and failed Kickstarters, and there was a decent number of overlap. Product design was #1 in both, so that I guess just speaks to the popularity of the category. Nonfiction, horror, and drinks are also in both of these top lists over here. But there are definitely some unique ones, so such as like comedy, comic books, quilts. These were prevalent in the successful category, and they didn't really make an appearance in the failed one. Then I wanted to also look at the number of backers per category by year, and also the amount of dollars pledged per category per year. So these graphs look pretty similar, which makes sense, but a couple interesting things, like how between 2013 and 2014, we do see a dip in the number of backers, but we actually see an increase in the amount of dollars pledged. And as you can see, it kind of looks like even though some of these things maybe have less backers, like technology has less backers than games over here, in 2015, they actually had more dollars pledged on average. So it seems like people are willing to make higher donations to technology campaigns. Otherwise, it seems like you can see that some categories definitely have a much larger amount of backers than others. Consistently at the bottom was where things like art at the very bottom wasn't usually super successful. Then I just took a quick look at my pledge per backer column. And since that was normalized, of course, this graph does look a little different than the others. But there were still some notable trends, such as in 2018, when almost every other category saw a decrease in pledge per backer, food actually saw a pretty large increase. That's this white column over here. And also, just that, I thought that it would look pretty similar to the graphs we made up here, which it does, consistently rising and then kind of falling in the later years. Although we did have, for pledge per backer, 2017 was actually, it seemed like more categories saw more success than in 2014, which was not the case in the graphs we saw above. Then I also made a couple word clouds. I thought this was pretty interesting. So I made word clouds of what words came up the most in the titles of successful campaigns, and I also did that for which words came up the most in the titles of failed campaigns. As you can see, some of these are pretty generic, like new, of course, and then some of them just have to do with maybe like more of the more common projects, such as like album, book. Those are pretty generic as well, or record, or record, I guess. There were some interesting ones that made the cut though. You know, if you look at this, you can see like Moon, Rebel, and Darkness. I thought that was interesting. And I also saw like some buzzwords in here like HIIT. I know that in the fitness community that's like high intensity interval training, and that's kind of been a buzzword there. So things like that, or like yoga, that's been pretty popular for I guess a while now. Um, and then an interesting number of names as well. And then actually there was definitely some overlap in the failed campaign. As you can see, new appears here as well too. And then some of these generic things like film, comedy, novel. Um, it is kind of interesting which quote-unquote generic words appear and don't appear in each graph. I also thought it was interesting that in the failed one we see help and needs, which kind of leads me to believe that people like to invest in things and kind of go for like exciting things maybe rather than like helping people in need, those sort of campaigns, which is interesting. Um, and then there's also some environmental buzzwords in the failed cloud as well, but they seem to be a little more generic, like Earth, and I think green is floating around here somewhere as well. I also saw that you know there were like locations listed in both cloud, but they tended to be more general in the successful one. Like in here, China is floating around somewhere, as is America. Whereas in this one, like Orleans, London, these are more specific. So it looks like the specific locations maybe didn't appeal to as many people. So after all that EDA, I decided to start preparing my data for classification. I made a couple of my own little variables to sort of look at the title column a little closely because I thought that that did kind of provide a lot of insight to what we were looking at. So we had, I made one with name length to measure the amount of letters in a title, you know, which projects titles contained question marks or exclamation points, etc. Um, you know, let's see. A lot of this is just data prep. I also did download this package called TextStat, which includes a bunch of different measures for quote-unquote readability. So basically, these scales analyze the string data and then assign scores. A lot of them correlate with like grade levels. So for instance, if a sentence has a Flesch Kincaid grade of 6.1, it means that a sixth grader could read it. In my actual notebook, I provided a link so people could check more on TextStat if they were interested. But I thought those were pretty interesting. And then I dropped some of the columns that became redundant, such as names, so we extracted a bunch of variables from that. Or, you know, the columns that we couldn't really use because they wouldn't be determined until after a project is over, such as the number of backers or the amount pledged. And then this is just me fixing some of the column names because with when we want to code everything, we just wanted to make sure all these titles look clean, you know. And then I looked at some correlations. I looked for multicollinearity. As you can see, most of it is this soft, nice green, which says it's in the clear, but we did have some of this alarming white that said that there was high correlation between some of these variables, which makes sense because we did download like 10 of these TextStat scales to use. So I ended up dropping about 5 of them, about half of them. One hot encoding, what the categorical variables, checking out the shape. Wow, look at all these columns. And then loading the modules I did in at the beginning of my notebook, such as classification report, standard scalar, all my classifiers over here. And I did my test train split, test size of about 20%. And I just jumped right in. I did about 9 different classifiers, and I got their accuracy as well as classification report and a little confusion matrix for each one, so I could look at those. We did logistic regression, cap boost. As you can see, a lot of their accuracy is hovering around the same amount, 71 over here. Logistic regression was about 69. Some of them took forever to run, hour and 40 minutes for k-nearest neighbors. Looks like our F1 scores, if you've been looking, have all been between 0.7 and 0.8 as well. Vector machine, Gaussian naive Bayes, decision tree, random forest, yeah, Ada boost, about 45 minutes to run. Like I said, about 0.8 here, 70% accuracy. And then I decided to put them all in a little data frame with the name of the model as well as the accuracy score it received. As you can see, like I said, a lot of these things were pretty close to each other, so I thought that was good. It looks like Gaussian knife base, probably not the right one for me to use. It's about 20% lower than our top scores over here, and 10% lower than the second lowest classifier, which was decision tree. Cat boost is about 1% and almost 1.5% higher than random forest and Ada boost, which are pretty neck and neck. I did want to see if I could improve anything, so I decided to create a pipeline and use grid search CV to do a little bit of parameter tuning. Just because some of these classifiers took a long time to run, I didn't want to do too many parameters. I did play around with it a little bit before I kind of settled on these, but I let that do its thing, and I was able to, after we printed out the best parameters and applied those, we got an accuracy of 70.8, so we saw that raised the accuracy of the model by about 0.5%, so not bad. And then I still wanted to see if we can make any improvements, and I knew that we did have an imbalance of classes. You know, there were so many more failed campaigns than successful ones. So I decided to, remedy this with Smote, which is a popular oversampling method to create new minority instances. Scaling my data again, importing Smote, fitting it. That took about 45 minutes. And as you can see, it worked. We now have our balanced classes. And just for the sake of time, I ended up just running about half of my models, like I said, since a lot of them took a while. So I only ran logistic regression, random forest, cat boost, decision tree. And it looks like they all did about the same or a little bit worse. And then considering how long it took, decided that Smoke probably was not the answer. So I decided to accept the classifiers as they were. And start looking at the top features. So for Cat Boost, as you can see, it looks like USD Goal Reel and Span of Project top the list with feature importance. I just took the top 25 most important features since we had about, I think, 230 total features. I also took a look at Ada Boost and Random Forest. Ada Boost had a lot of similar ones too. They also had USD Goal Reel and Span of Project in first and second place respectively. And just like in Cat Boost, you can see that there were actually also a lot of our text stat variables like Flesh Kincaid and Dale Trawl readability. And a couple of the year variables make an appearance, such as launch year 2013, 2014. Same within over here. So there's a decent amount of overlap between Ada Boost and Cat Boost. Then Random Forest, that one had a couple different things. We saw launch day in here, like 5 days were in here, which I didn't see in the other graphs, so that was interesting. But USD Goal Reel was at the top of the list again, and followed by Span of Project. And then I decided to just take a look at what features were included in all of them, and I saw that, again, about 5 of our text stat variables made the cut. Span of Project and USD Goal Reel were, of course, consistently in the top of all 3 of our top performing classifiers. And then a few more surprising things, such as the subcategories of shorts and tabletop games, which I thought was interesting, and main categories of music, theater, and comics. I thought it was interesting that technology didn't make the cut, considering how popular it was and how well it seemed to do in our EDA. So my findings were that really the most important features to determining success of your classifier project were the monetary goal that you chose, as well as the duration of the project, um, and then making sure that your title is readable. I'm sure that that has a huge influence. Um, and then of course some of these categories seem to be a little more successful than others, such as music and theater. Um, and then some things that are out of our control, such as launch year 2013, 14, and 15. That seems to probably be when Kickstarter was at its peak. It does look like it's dropped off in popularity over the years, so that is something to be mindful of. Uh, in the future, I think it would be really interesting to do to look at user data about the users who launch these sorts of campaigns. I think that could provide of um, a lot of answers to questions, um, and probably improve the accuracy of our model, just to know like things such as age, gender, of number of like Facebook friends a person has, because obviously since a lot of these are shared via social media, that could probably have a huge impact. But it was interesting to look at the data as is, because obviously you can't change or easily change a lot of aspects about who you are as a person, or how large your social reach is. Those are not as easy to change compared to things like the goal that you set, or how you word your title. And I'd also like to, on this data that we have, implement more principal component analysis and additional hyperparameter tuning, as well as maybe see what happens if I remove the outliers and see how that influences things. But as is, this is how these are our results. These are the most important features. All right, thank you so much for listening. Bye.